Welcome to another edition of Cop Talk, Two Jews, Muse, about the news. I'm Bob Cohn, Editor-in-Chief Emeritus of the St. Louis Jewish Light, and with me is Larry Levin, Publisher and CEO of the Jewish Light, along with Mike Sherwin, Managing Editor of the paper and producer of this video program. Larry, let's launch into our discussion looking back on the not-too-distant past, on the very recent and successful Golden Gala, which marked the 50th anniversary of the Jewish Light as an autonomous Jewish community newspaper with its own board. How would you evaluate the significance of this event for the newspaper and for the St. Louis Jewish community?
I think the most important aspect of it, aside from looking back at the incredible history, much of which includes you and Lois Kaplan and many others, is that we're here. We've seen lots of Jewish newspapers, news organizations fall by the wayside. The recession was not kind to a lot of our colleagues. We've seen several in major cities fold. The fact that we had this kind of community support with over 400 people coming to our gala, tremendous amount of financial support, tremendous amount of support for the idea of independent Jewish community news. I think that's outstanding, and St. Louis Jews deserve a tremendous amount of credit for speaking up by attending and supporting the continued existence of the Jewish Light.
You and I were just listening to Jeff, a piece on NPR about Jeff Bezos of Amazon, and how Borders went under because it did not develop its own internal capacity to handle the new technologies. And you and Mike Sherwin have embraced that new technology, which helps us bridge into the next generation.
I was emailing back and forth today with a friend of mine who works for the International Herald Tribune, and they're just getting rebranded as the International New York Times, which is going to be a big change. And it was funny because it was him and me and a friend of mine who's been the business manager of the Daily Nebraskan, the college newspaper in Lincoln, Nebraska for the last 30 years. And I said at least two of the three of us are working for healthy organizations. And the joke was, community news and college news are things that probably have the strongest potential for sticking around because they're unique and you can tell the story when nobody else can. Obviously, the New York Times is going to be around for a long time, but the point is, at the national and international level, there's lots of competition for that news. There's lots of people creating that news. We're the only game in town. Same with the college paper. So it's a really important franchise for a community.
Yeah, and I started out as editor of Student Life and later of the law school
at Washington
U.
Yeah.
We have the Or Hadash, which I understand is having a meeting this evening as we're taping.
Biggest staff so far in its 6-year history.
It's an amazing, and the fact that there's no lack of interest in serious journalism on the part of younger people, very encouraging for our future. Let's switch gears a little bit towards the national front. Depressingly, the federal government shutdown continues with no early solution in sight. We had a couple of hints there might have been a breakthrough, but none of those have come to fruition. And as we speak, there's a looming possibility of the U.S. will, for the first time in its entire history, default on its national debt. Why is our national government, in your opinion, so dysfunctional? And what does this portend for the stability of our nation, including the Jewish community?
Well, I know people like to say it's both sides or it's all sides, but in this case, there's simply been a budget and a continuing resolution for a budget presented to Congress. There's been regular debt ceiling increases on an ongoing basis. In this particular case, it is a small segment of the majority party in the House of Representatives that is keeping things from going forward. You can't make up that there's some sort of two-sided kind of issue here. There isn't. There's a one-sided issue, and the leadership of the majority party is choosing to allow those who are on the ultra-conservative side to carry the day. In fact, they adopted a rule, right before this happened that said that, only the speaker and the speaker's designee could bring a bill to the floor on this matter. That is ridiculous. It's anti-democratic with a lowercase d. It's wrong. It definitely obliterates the notion of fair and continuing democracy. It's terrible, terrible, terrible. And look at the world. The world leaders are coming to the United States and saying, you need to fix this for the good of the entire world's economy. I mean, that's shameful and embarrassing and wrong.
Yeah, I really agree with you, and I know that I worked at one time for a guy who was a progressive Republican named Larry Roos. He's spinning in his grave, I am sure, because he told me that a Republican like him who was progressive and a good government guy could never get nominated nowadays. And back in '64, when I started working for him, the Republican Party nominated Barry Goldwater and gave great satisfaction to the extreme right, but he was swamped in the forthcoming election.
I read a great quote, I can't remember who it was from, who said, there are 90 Tea Party members in the House of Representatives, but there are no Occupy Wall Street members in the House of Representatives.
That's a very good point.
Sometimes it's just not equivalent, and sometimes it's one side.
Yeah.
You know, in the 60s, a lot of time it was the far left. You know, right now it's the far right, and we got to fix it.
No question about it.
Yeah.
So let's hope that by the time we do our next COP talk, we'll be on the road to rationality. Okay, on the international scene, the New York Times had a page-one story last week that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel has become, in their words, a lonely voice of skepticism about the new allegedly moderate president of Iran, Hassan Rouhani, calling him a wolf in sheep's clothing. Do you believe that Bibi's concerns are well-founded, or is he just refusing to take a new leader's yes for an answer?
It's a great question. I mean, I think whenever there is a glimmer of hope of a solution, you know, you should grasp it and run with it and see what you can accomplish. That doesn't mean that the thumbscrews shouldn't be kept on Iran. Far from it. You know, there has to be total cessation of uranium enrichment for any sort of discussion to proceed. And that would be the good faith demonstration by Iran. I mean, if I were living in Iran's backyard and I saw the history of what Iran has done in the Middle East, you know, I'd be just as concerned and skeptical. But it's possible, it may not be probable yet, but it's possible that this is resulting from the severe sanctions that have been imposed on Iran and is hitting them in several different ways. They can't sell their oil. Their currency is plummeting in terms of its valuation and is almost worthless beyond the borders of Iran. And there are assets frozen all over the place in banks around the world. So it's a triple whammy to Iran.
Yes, it sure is.
And if you look at it from a realpolitik perspective, they got to do something. Because no matter what they believe didactically, they're in a world of hurt, and their people are going to revolt if they can't keep a stable government and a stable economy in place.
Yeah, and I still have a healthy skepticism, as I'm sure you do, about whether Rouhani is for real. But he was clearly elected by the people who wanted change in Iran, and certainly his words of seeming moderation deserve to be tested before any resort.
And remember, he was the mullahs left him on the ballot. I mean, you know, there have been people that they haven't allowed to be on the ballot before. You know, so to me, it's telling not just that he won convincingly, but that he was there in the first place as an alternative. So you know, desperate times and desperate measures, and maybe even though they would much rather be true to their cause of hating Israel and the West and the United States, they have to do something for the sake of the Iranian people.
No question about it. Right now, are you encouraged by the reports that the Syrian government of dictator Bashar Assad is cooperating with a team of chemical weapons inspectors who indicate that substantial progress, in their words, has been made, actually won the Nobel Peace Prize this week, in destroying some of Syria's reported 1,000 tons of chemical weapons, and do you really trust the Russians to be objective when it comes to Syria, when Russia has supplied sophisticated conventional weapons to use against the opposition?
Trust? I don't know if trust is the right question. Do I believe that we can succeed in seeing the current crop of chemical weapons in Syria largely destroyed? Probably. Do I think there have been vast promises by Russia towards Syria, you know, on the backside, you know, in consideration of that result? Probably. You know, and I doubt we know really what's been promised between the two countries. You know, Syria wants to remain strong in the region. Russia wants to increase its strength in the region and its leverage in the region. Those who say that this is a mistake by the United States and President Obama, I don't know how to react to that, because isn't the goal to get rid of the chemical weapons if you can? I do think it is. I don't know how we would accomplish that and keep Russia totally on the sidelines. What do you think?
Well, Russia is the chief backer, just like we sometimes depend on China, mainland China, to lean on North Korea, and it appears that some of that leaning was done, because you're not hearing Kim Jong-un making these bellicose threats every 15 minutes like he was doing for several weeks. And I think Russia could have a similarly constraining effect on Bashar Assad, who depends entirely on Russia's largesse to stay in power.
And it's really funny how people talk about the coming of another Cold War. But if you remember, when President Reagan was the iconic leader at the time that the wall came down, what were people worried about? They were worried about the potential for non-state intervention to take more of a foothold in the world, and we saw that. We saw that with Al Qaeda. We saw that with other terrorist organizations. We saw that with, he's a state leader in Assad, but in partnership with
Yes.
Non-state leaders. And you know, there are some strengths to having, you know, governmental partners, relatively stable governmental partners who, even though you don't agree with their ideology, you can look at them and say, take care of these problems. And there are potentials for stability where maybe in dealing with non-state actors or rogue state actors, you don't have that potential.
And under both Assads, and I'm certainly in no way discounting the significance of their horrible chemical weapons attack, but both Assads really kept that border between Israel and Syria quiet since 1973.
Yeah.
So something to be taken into account. All right, now the Pew Research Organization last week released the scientifically conducted study of the Jewish population that said the good news was 6.8 million instead of 5.1 million as it was before. Bad news, though, this is in a report that I got from the American Jewish Congress. In a nutshell, the New York Times summed up Pew's survey findings as, quote, a significant rise in those who are not religious, who marry outside the faith, and who are not raising their children Jewish. What are the implications, not only for the Jewish light, of course, but just for the Jewish community at large?
Well, I think it's way too early, and one of the reasons that we haven't yet written an editorial is because there are so many opinions about this study, so many interpretations of this study. Some people say it's doom and gloom for Jewish America. Some people say it's being misinterpreted. Some people say this is no different than what's happening in most other religious communities in the United States, where you have those who are the most devout growing, and you have those who are in the middle and the least devout kind of dissipating into heterogeneity in the general population. So is it a lot to get excited about? I don't know yet. I want to see more what people say about it. What does it mean in terms of affiliation? We have Ron Wolfson, an expert on this topic, coming for our Can We Talk series. I want to hear what he has to say. I want to hear more what local leaders have to say. We're going to get more opinions about it from people. I'm slow to react to something like this by saying the sky is falling, when basically it's a bunch of data that needs to be looked at and thought about. Sociology was never intended to be, you know, a pop segment where you could look at it after 8 days, after a report is issued, and say, I know all the answers. I'm not smart enough to look at a study like this and know the fallout. I need some time to digest it.
I agree, and I know that the Jewish Light is conducting a readership survey in the near future. But is there a need for a generic population study focused strictly on St. Louis in addition to the...
There is, and we've talked about that, and the Jewish Federation is going to do one. And it's always needed, and I don't mean to poo-poo the study,
Sure.
the Pew study in any way. It's wonderful that we have all this data. But yes, we do need to find out more about the characteristics of our own community. We need to know whether it's similar or different to other communities. You know, what sets it apart and what makes it similar. You know, we know some things that are happening across most communities. We know that the Orthodox or so-called observant communities tend to be growing relative to the rest of the community. We know that Reform communities tend to be very inclusive. And then we know that the conservative movement has had its share of challenges, you know, in the middle. Mm-hmm. And this report would certainly suggest the same. But then if you talk to some of our conservative leaders locally, they'll tell you that through merger, you know, through aggressive work on encouraging attendance and encouraging membership, they've done a real good job on finding a proper niche for them as well. So again, I don't want to read too much into what's happened. I look forward to the opportunity to see a local study, which I think we'll get in the next year or two.
And continuing our tradition of wanting to end our little interviews each month on a somewhat happy note, because there's so much grim news in the world today. A few years ago, they were making jokes about Christmaka and Festivus for the rest of us. Now we have the rare coincidence of Thanksgiving and Hanukkah with turkey-shaped menorahs, etc. Are there any ways in which the Jews of our community and worldwide, or nationally, could conflate those holidays appropriately and celebrate them.
I hope so, Bob. I mean, I don't know about you, but in my childhood, you know, when I was growing up, Thanksgiving felt very much like a Jewish holiday. It felt very much like we were giving thanks for living in a land of freedom and a land where opportunity was available to us as Jews along with others. And so I've always felt it to be part of the fabric of my particular Judaism. What about you?
That's well said, and I hope that there will be another Hanukkah miracle, maybe a wishbone in the shape of a Jewish star.
Yeah?
And the turkey will last for a miraculous 8 days, I am sure.
Or a peace treaty.
There you go. Thank you, and on that very positive note, thanks to Larry Levin, I'm Bob Cohn, and our producer Mike Sherwin signing off for another session of Cop Talk.
Take care. Bye.